first of all, welcome everybody. Delighted that you're here. Delighted especially to our guests here. I'll introduce you in a minute. And to what is the first seminar of our series, Where's Urban Politics? I'm Marian Counihan from the University College Groningen.
And I'm Lamker from the Faculty of Spatial Sciences.
And we've got a whole team helping us to organize this, and I'll give you the date of the next seminar at the end of this. But before we start, I thought it was just good to sort of reflect on why are we organizing this series and what do we mean with that question, just to create a little bit of maybe shared understanding, which we can come back to throughout the series. I think there are many reasons we could give why we're having this series. Some of them are more urgent, some of them are more evergreen. I'm a philosopher, so our problems tend to shift somewhat more slowly than in other disciplines. But I think we're all very aware at this point in time that democracy is certainly not a given, but a highly contingent state of affairs which needs to be defended and maintained, and which is under threat from many angles. And maybe we're also aware in our environment that there is a seeming re-emergence of urban political action, at least in the context of Dutch cities. There's been this kind of re-emergence of political activism, which is very visible on city streets in the last years, after a period of seeming dormancy. But the question is, of course, broader than that. So I think before we start, it's nice to think, what is that question? How can we unpack it? Many disciplines, discourses, registers are available to us to unpack it. So very briefly, I'm going to just go through this question and think about those terms that are in it and how we can think about them. Please add if you think of anything I missed. So the where is urban politics? What could we mean with where? We can be talking about, I don't know, no. Yeah, it doesn't matter, I'll just talk. How to think about the question, where's urban politics? Yes, so we can think about it more concretely, just spatially, the city as a built environment. What are the spaces? What are the networks? What are the sites which are claimed or used for urban politics? What are the scales? So urban politics is obviously also not only shaped by the city scale, but also, regional and below that, above that, national, supranational even, below that, the neighborhood level, but also more sort of temporally. So what are the kind of discussions? So this is more kind of conceptual. What are the kind of discussions? What are our understandings of urban politics, and how are those moving? And where do those happen in academia? So where are they being discussed, in which different disciplines? And there I think actually we've got, and I hope that the series is actually going to do this, we've got really a wide range of disciplines that talk to this question and that we would like to access. And already you guys are working in a very interdisciplinary fashion, I would say. But here are two, a geographer, David Harvey, and philosopher, Hannah Arendt, who've also really both addressed this question in their own way. Then we can look at that urban. What do we mean with the urban in urban politics? And we can think of the city as a physical space, as a built environment, which facilitates or undermines political life. But we can also think of the city as a polis, which is more like an idea of the city, which is obviously a very rich idea of the city as a sort of base site for where society and politics have sort of emerged from, also sort of historically in some senses. The space of appearance, that's a term from Arendt. So here we're sort of tapping into the urban as an idea, productive idea, as you to put it in your terms from your book. But we can also think of the city as a process, or as an herb, as a hub for circulation, which is more entwined with our economic system, economic logics, and the attendant, for instance, environmental tolls that takes beyond the site of the urban. The idea of sort of planetary urbanization comes to the fore there. And then finally, we can think about politics. What do we mean with politics? And this has really come up in our discussions of it this morning, the difference between politics with a sort of capital P, formal politics. Hey, come in. Local governments, policies, protests, urban planning, perhaps. And this is the kind of maybe recognized politics largely, or not always, but then there's also the sort of small p political power relations, maybe even politics which is hiding, which is seemingly apolitical, where there might be stakeholders in the urban context who are not even recognized as political actors at all. And I think Darren's talk will speak to this later. All in all, a very rich question to tackle. And I think eventually we are here because we feel we need to activate urban politics, because as I think Ross and Philippe will also invite us to think about, because there's potential for more engaged citizenship, for more democracy coming from this urban context, and that we need it at this time. So we are very delighted to welcome our speakers. We've got 3 speakers this afternoon, Ross Beveridge and Philippe Koch, who will speak first, and then Darren Searhouse. Briefly, Ross is Senior Lecturer in Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow. Philippe is Professor in Urban Politics at the School of Architecture, Design and Civil Engineering at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, but is potentially in other roles, or has lots of also experience outside of academia in politics, for instance. Darren Searhouse is lecturer and researcher at the Hogeschool of Amsterdam and is doing his PhD on the dynamics around urban development, especially in these kind of sustainability challenges and urban innovation labs which arise around that. Back to Ross and Philippe, we've invited you here because you've published this wonderful wide-ranging book, How Cities Can Transform Democracy, which is in the library, University Library, and also an article, Seeing Democracy Like a City, which I think has been very well received. And quoting from you, you argue that urbanization is generative of a different rationality of political engagement, and with that, a different democratic vision. So we very much look forward to hearing about this democratic vision and how we can realize it, of course. So I'd like to hand over the floor to you.
Yeah, I would invite all of you during the presentation, prepare questions, comments, provocative thoughts that you have around the issue. Where is urban politics? So where, spatially, relationally, in your mind, somewhere outside urban? What is urban? Is it Groningen? Is it the province? Is it the state? Is it a state of being? Is it a relation? Is it the way how you live? And politics, so what makes politics? The actions that we do, or the elections that we go to or not go, or both? Is the civil society initiative part of politics? I would say yes. Tradition, or do we treat that separately from politics and democracy? So I think we are going to have quite good discussions on that afterwards.
Yeah.
And yeah, we will share a bit the moderation, but we invite you to be as provocative as you want. So this should be an open space for having discussions that are challenging also our way to rediscover urban politics, the title for today's seminar.
Okay, over to you.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks to Marian and Christian for the really generous invitation and the great half day we've already had going around the city. It's been amazing, and I'm really looking forward to the talk. We both are, and also to tomorrow. We have a full series of events, and also to say what a great series you've organised. The questions you were asking in your presentation are already things that we will be talking about, at least some of the themes we will be talking about in our presentation. Philippe and I will be doing this as a kind of a double act, with less jokes than a normal double act. So I think I will have around 10-15 minutes. So about then, and then you just keep an eye on it. I've got my clock there. So as Marian said, this is largely based on a book we wrote recently, and an article we published, Seeing Democracy Like a City. And in some ways it's quite theoretical, although it's based on our readings of what happens in cities, our readings of urban politics, essentially. To make that a bit more graspable, I'm going to give you kind of the ending in a way at the beginning. So there are 2 thrusts running through the presentations, running through the book and articles that we've written recently. So the first one is related to democracy, and it's related to this idea in particular that we might have misplaced the idea of democracy, or we might have lost the original idea and meaning of democracy. In particular, we might have forgotten that democracy, or we might have been distracted by some of the state-based discussions of democracy, might have distracted us from realizing that democracy should be something that's embedded or close to our everyday lives. So democracy should be something that is close to our social lives. So that's one thrust in relation to all the crises going around with democracy. So the original idea of democracy was going in this direction. The second thrust relates to urbanization. So if the first one's a bit more about political theory, the second part of it is much more to do with geography and planning and that kind of thing. So urbanization, for many geographers, for many political economists, is the driving force, a global force. So as well as transforming landscapes and cities, as we will discuss briefly, it's also, we argue, transforming politics. Marian, you mentioned a resurgence of urban politics in recent years. And we would argue that urbanization provides a way of thinking about lots of the political practices which we've seen emerge in cities in the last 10 to 15 years. There's a politics of urbanization, not just a politics of an urban politics per se. There's a politics related to urbanization as a process which connects places as well as shaping specific cities. And so the connection between these two parts, these two thrusts, the democracy bit and the urbanization bit, is the city, we will argue. So the city, or whatever the city is, and there's obviously some discussion what a city is. In our view, the city is the name or the location for democracy within a context of urbanization. So a way of thinking about how we can bring democracy closer or indeed into people's everyday lives in a context of global urbanization. So that's the kind of rough frame. Let's see if and how we can get to that argument in the next 40 minutes. It's about 45 minutes, I think. So I'm going to start with an example. So I said it was quite theoretical, but I'm going to start with an example. So this is what you see here is a picture of the south side, an area in the south side of Glasgow called Pollock Shields. Indeed, it's a street, Kenmure Street, the Kenmure Street protest in May 2021. Now, what happened in this protest was that there was a dawn raid. It was a Sunday morning, a typical time for the immigration services to do a raid. And they took two men, originally from India, who'd been living in Glasgow for quite a long time, but without permanent residence to stay in the UK. So they were taken from one of the flats, one of the apartments in the building here, into the van. And in the time, or in the time that it took to get them out of the property, through word of mouth, through connections between activist groups in the area. So this area is has quite a strong activist scene. People came out onto the street. It's a very diverse area as well. So lots of people came out to the street to find out what was going on. They heard what was happening. Someone was getting taken away. And essentially they blocked the police van, the immigration enforcement van in the middle. So it was a kind of a spontaneous moment. Spontaneous, but also including lots of planning, of course, because activist networks plan and talk to each other. So people came from other parts around the city as quickly as they could, as well as the residents. So essentially the people in the van, the two men who were due to be taken away, were blocked inside the van, and the van itself couldn't move. The police were then called. And you can see the police were encircling the van. And everyone's wearing masks. It was during COVID, during the lockdown. And at some point, the van couldn't move forward or backwards. The police decided that, so not the immigration service, the police decided that they would have to release the two men, return them to their property, because there was a COVID situation, it was a public health situation. It was too dangerous to have people congregating in the street because of the risk of contagious spread of the COVID virus. So essentially, this was then led to huge celebrations. There was a massive, and this negotiation went on for an hour or 2 hours or something. There were rumours that the First Minister of Scotland also called and told the police to let them go. And this was celebrated, of course, by a lot of the activist groups, the immigration support networks, and most people lived in the area. It's a great kind of victory for some kind of democracy. I mean, you can see in this picture, we see some of the key questions that democratic theories always address, going back to ancient Greece and Athens. So, is this a mob, unruly people threatening the state, or is this the demos, the people, the rightful force of democracy, exerting their rule? And if this is the demos, where does it begin and end? Does it end at the end of the street? Where does it begin? How long should it last? And what kind of issues is it raising? What kind of city is it demanding? We have the conflict between borders being enforced by the immigration service, and we had demands, you can't really see, but the word placards and things about no borders, don't take my neighbours away. This appeals to kind of a kind of form of global society within the city, indeed within this area of Glasgow. And who is the state? And who is the state, this singular sovereign force? The immigration service was essentially overruled by the police. The police reversed the decision of the immigration service in this case. So for us, this was already raising lots and lots of questions. In the aftermath of this, when there's a kind of celebratory feeling, of course, it's great that these two men from India were allowed to stay, at least initially. Pina Aksu from the Maryhill Integration Network, which is a kind of asylum seekers support network within Glasgow, said they messed with the wrong city. She was referring to the immigration service. So when she said that, she was really appealing to a certain self-understanding that lots of Glaswegians have. And you can find it in other cities, of course, as well. But there's a certain view of Glasgow as a kind of rebellious place, a place that has really rich, particularly leftist politics. You see the black and white, the grainy black and white one is rent strikes during the First World War. It was the last time the British Army was used on mainland Britain in a political protest. It was Winston Churchill who put the tanks in the streets in Glasgow to quell the rent strikes, people demanding rent caps, essentially. Housing crisis, couldn't afford to pay their rent. The other black and white photo is referring to the workers' movement. You know, was a big industrial city, Glasgow, particularly around the docks. There's this kind of charismatic figure there of Jimmy Reid, trade unionist, talking to the workers down at the docks. And this was called Red Clydeside, and Red Clydeside, make Red Clydeside red again. So this is one invocation of what a city could be. So when Pina Aksu was saying they messed with the wrong city, she's tapping into these ideas of the place. But of course, it's not the only image of a city or a place. There's never one singular, steady, stable thing to be invoked. And of course, in the weeks immediately after this incident with the immigration services and leading up to the last few weeks, we've had increasing right-wing protests, as we've had in other parts of the UK and Europe. Stop the boats, which is referring to boats coming across from France. And this is a very different kind of Glasgow that they're invoking. So this is raising the question, so the city seems to have this productivity, people are really talking about, wow, it can be a force or something, but this is contested force. Whose city? Who does it belong to? Why should we be interested in it? So these are some of the questions that we were trying to grapple with when we were writing the book. And Marian's already referred to some of the wider context, why we might need to do that. There is certainly a really visible, felt crisis of established liberal democracy for at least a decade, perhaps longer. It really is a question of how far democracy is compatible with capitalism. And there is a question of what role the state has in that context. Can we turn to the state? Is there a way to return to the state, perhaps the welfare state, some kind of idealized image of the state 30 or 40 years ago? Is that the way to save democracy in the face of the multiple challenges that it's now encountering? Or are there other ways of thinking about democracy, rethinking democracy? Is there a different project of democracy, one linking into the way politics is already happening? That's where we take it up, I suppose. And then we start to ask this question, okay, if people are talking about the city, invoking the city in political struggles, how do we think that through as a form of democracy, as a form of politics? First question is, if there are any geographers in the room, would be the one that is the result of urbanization. Is the city a real thing in the context of all these global flows, this merging or these blurring between countryside and city? How do urbanites actually engage the city as a project of democracy? What kind of practices are there? What can we see? Are there patterns? Is there really some kind of emerging vision of an alternative form of politics related to the city? And what might be the implications of that, if there is? So, if we start thinking in relation to political theory, the Greek polis is obviously an obvious place to start. Is often seen in terms of this the city, this place of the city being almost synonymous with the state. So one interpretation is that democracy in politics comes from the presence of the state in the city. City and the state are together, one word with a hyphen. Another reading of that, and this is a reading provided by Canadian political theorist, Warren Magnuson, was that even in these writings, so this is, we're going back to Aristotle, Plato, all these kind of periods, these interpretations of it, they're missing something about this period, about all forms of urban politics. But politics, the political character of places, of cities, isn't an effect, an outcome of the state's presence, it's an outcome of the urban condition, urban ways of life, urban contexts. Politics doesn't emanate from a sovereign force. Of course, the state is a political presence, but it's not the source necessarily of the democratic character of the city. So it's possible to start separating the city from the state, or not making democracy dependent on the state. Now, if we start dealing with questions of where the city ends and begins, if the city isn't a state and isn't about jurisdictions and boundaries, spatial or administrative or whatever, what is the city then? And this is kind of the three of the main ways we address that in our book. So we argue the city, well, we do it in a negative way and then in a positive way. So the city is not a political jurisdiction where we find new democratic models for an urban age. So we can't go back to the age of the city-states, whether that's Athens or it's medieval Europe or whatever. Can't go back to a period where the state and the city are in unison together. The city is also not a distinct social spatial form for the urban society to reinvent democracy. Urbanization these churning processes, these links between places, challenge an idea of a sovereign state form being able to control a particular space. But the city is, and is often in practice, a political imaginary to articulate and situate democratic practices, publics, and places. So this idea of the city is theoretically grounded in the idea of the city as a category of practice. So in plainer terms, we understand the city or the urban in the way in which it is practiced and lived. So in the way in which it is represented and made sense of, even enacted by people who live in cities, by urbanites themselves. The city is still an idea. It has its resonance because it is linked to political theory, because it's linked to political moments of the past. It still can mobilize people in very particular local ways, the idea of a particular city like Glasgow, or the idea of the city. And thus the city is a way to localize and situate claims for democracy and democratic action. So the city, rather than the state, or perhaps the nation, or it can be seen as another imaginary around which democracy can be organized and located. So if we look across urban theory as a whole, if you try to take a kind of look across the state of urban research, it's an interdisciplinary field, of course. We see across the different disciplines of urban studies, sociology, geography, politics, and also from different theoretical perspectives, political economy, Marxist, neo-Marxist perspectives, as well as post-structural, cultural perspectives. Diverse strands that really point to, and indeed are already reimagining politics, or providing different languages and registers for political action in relation to the urban. So there's a form of urbanization of politics occurring already. So we have Julien Boudreau, a sociologist, urban sociologist, who writes about an urban logic of political action, which is networked. It's decentered, a generative kind of networks connecting people in interests. We have urbanity as a mode of being political. This Warren Magnuson argument that being in urban space, occupying urban space, creates forms, registers, modes of being political, different to national politics. I think of Abdul Malik Simone, writing particularly about the South, the global South. Cities there is having this self-governing capacity, where we talk about context where the state isn't very is present or isn't as visible as a political force. There's some kind of organized, disorganized dynamic through which collectives come together. And then in a more political economy, neo-Lefebvrean perspective, we see capitalism driving contradictions which take material spatial form. They become visible in cities, clashes of interest, and generally these create inequalities, of course they do, but through these inequalities, differential urbanization can emerge. So this is the idea that spaces of opportunity emerge within the inequalities that capitalism produces. So there's a range of literature there, providing us with tools by which we can reimagine politics, potentially also democracy, in very urban ways. I think at that point, I'm going to hand over to Philippe.
So, hello everybody from my side. The second part, or my part, is really trying to connect those two threads that Ross set out at the beginning, and I'm going to read from my script and to make everything sound and in time. So what Ross already invoked is that in our research and writing, we are mainly interested in urbanization as a democratic question. There are democratic possibilities that urbanization provides, and there are different ways that these possibilities are put into action and how they are related to everyday life and the built environment. By urbanization, we mean a multifaceted process that shape and transform land, territories, and spatial practices. It is linked to more general or abstract systems and strategies of the economy, state regulations, and international bureaucracies. At the same time, urbanization is always anchored in situated everyday life, struggles over concrete realizations of spatial projects and lived space. And the other term, democracy, we understand democracy as a project or political struggle rather than an institutional framework. Arrangements of collective self-government are democratic to the extent that they embody an ethos which strives for equality through the articulation of and actions towards common concerns and demands. An urban logic of democracy is a process of advancing self-government through and for urban collectives claiming their right to the city, to access, enjoy, co-produce, and benefit from urban space and urban life. So how does urbanization change democracy? Urbanization seems like an unlikely choice to begin to kind of flourish democracy. Urbanization seems to undermine rather than foster common understandings of democracy. The dynamics of urbanization, the forces of creative destruction linked to urbanization are the causes of most of the pressing problems of humanity: energy consumption, destruction of environment, access and use of resources and public infrastructures. The usual way, at least in urban political science, is to look at the relation between urbanization and democracy, to ask how democracy can shape and organize urbanization. In much research, urbanization is conceived first and foremost as a problem of territorial governance and regulation, as urbanization undermines or ignores existing political jurisdictions and makes it thus more difficult to find the steering capacity and political legitimacy necessary to address or even plan processes of spatial transformation. But as urban theory suggests, the literature that Ross was referring to, urbanization has implications for democracy. There are tensions imminent to urbanization, a tension between the social material urbanity that urbanization induces, the proximity of things, people from different backgrounds, the clashes of different technologies and knowledges, and the will of public authorities and administrative forces to tame or regulate this urbanity. Another tension is that between the urban form, the materiality of urbanization, the urban everyday life, the sociability of unlikely spaces, the encounters embedded in the urban form. Urbanization changes the site, the source, and the stake of democracy, we claim. It changes the ways it is enacted and practiced. We see multiple authorities aiming for and claiming self-government. We see that people engage with the material world around them, and we see urban collective life situated in the everyday as the site of politics. The source is a politics of social, spatial, material proximity grounded in local ambitions and knowledges and bodily practices. The stake is to access and to co-create the immediate urban environment. I think we think that herein lies the democratic horizon and meaning of urbanization: to have access to participate, to enjoy the benefits of urbanization and differential space as collective project and common property, or as Parcell puts it, quote, "If the spatial project of democracy is bound up with the production of differential space, then it must be also bound up with the questions of the urban and urban space. Democracy becomes then the project of urban inhabitants, in particular using their power to produce and manage urban space themselves." End of quote. In this view, urban democracy is not about the relation between states and citizens, but between people and the places they inhabit. In an earlier paper, we argued that there are at least 3 ways in which democracy is practiced in relation to urban space, beyond the usual institutionalized ways of democracy. And in the next few minutes, I will provide an example around housing, which kind of relates all 3 ways of how collective urban life kind of articulates democracy. And this example should really emphasize the need to think of democratic practices as embodied and material, to shift to more mundane locations of everyday life, and to foreground the spatial and political quality of the built environment. So the example is around cooperatives in Uruguay and Switzerland. And not only there, but housing has become, as you know, also we talked about it this morning, an intense field of urban struggle, at least since the financial meltdown of 2008. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, activists and scholars have increasingly turned to collective forms of housing as a strategy for the decommodification of housing. In our study, we argue that housing cooperatives as a collective form of housing are potentially powerful instruments to expand the use value of housing. The examples emphasize the embeddedness in urban everyday life and the alternative vision of a property regime to enable a different democratic politics through re-relating urban society to urban form. Switzerland and Uruguay are internationally recognized as frontrunners in cooperative housing. They emerged as bottom-up, both of them emerged as bottom-up social movements with strong connections to trade unions. Umbrella organizations and state support in both countries played a crucial role. In both countries, there are different types of cooperatives, but the vast majority continue to adhere to core values and principles, such as collective ownership of non-commodifiable housing, participation and democracy, which is a requirement for accessing public support. In Uruguay, the housing cooperative movement is a vital political agent influencing electoral politics and public policies that provided crucial support for progressive governments to get elected. The history of the Uruguayan case also highlights an interesting conceptual point. Facing a hostile political environment during the military dictatorship, the cooperative movement reinforced their political purpose and expanded their commitment towards the members and towards the wider public. Thus, the case of Uruguay is an interesting one of cooperatives actively resisting state coercion. The political role of Swiss housing cooperatives is less impressive. As members of housing cooperatives are first and foremost reliable constituencies for social democratic parties and instrumental to establish and maintain also ties between governments, political parties, and working and middle-class residents. So kind of a case of usual institutionalized political organizations, similar to a political party or NGO. And in contrast to the highly politicized housing cooperative movement in Uruguay, the Swiss case shows that over time, the close ties to the public administration and their important role in the implementation of the city housing and urban development policies contributed to a depoliticization of many housing cooperatives. In fact, most housing cooperatives settle for their existing housing stock and residents and don't consider in their mission to contribute to the provision of affordable housing in general to a wider public outside of their membership. However, this depoliticization has become an object of recurrent struggle and triggered an ongoing process of repoliticization. Urban social movements have been starting to reconceptualize housing as a right to live in the city, but also as a place for new forms and modes of social reproduction and community organization. Housing cooperatives have been discovered as established organizations to experiment with new forms of living. Through this repoliticization and appropriation of the organizational model of housing cooperatives, they are currently re-emerging as political actors and a form of collective urban life. In both countries, the principal goal of housing cooperatives is to renegotiate property regimes in relation to urban inhabitants and urban society, and to turn the housing stock into a commons and bring it under the control of a public commons partnership. Seen in such terms, housing cooperatives are aiming for the decommodification of housing and bring key urban resources under the control of self-governance. What is interesting in current housing struggles in different places around the globe is that the question of property is raised once again. The study on housing cooperatives in Switzerland and Uruguay shows alternative ways to conceptualize property, not only as a relation between a property holder and its property, but a relation between different humans and social groups to access, enjoy, and co-produce urban space. Property in a cooperative sense is not here to exclude other potential users, but to enable the commons and to broaden the access to the urban commonwealth. Struggling for a home is thus more than an attempt to fulfill private choices. Rather, it is a way to relate oneself as a person or collective to the wider social material world. In its attempt to overcome exclusion and alienation, it seeks to facilitate resonance in urban collective life through the alignment of people, materials, and space. It can be a means to overcome the power relation inscribed in the materiality and sociability of the city, and to re-establish a form of connection and resonance with the environment. It is one mode of locating democratic politics and infrastructure of self-government. So for finishing off, I will hand it over back to Ross.
So what does that example imply for approaching democracy? Well, the first strand of thinking would relate or can relate to a contrast, a contradiction or tension between political practices and political institutions, and how they relate to the health, the thriving nature or not of democracy. In this urban view of politics is actually happening in the cities around us. Practices, being together in practice, practicing on urban space, doing democracy, seem incredibly important, if not fundamental, to an urban vision of democracy. Institutions, although of course fundamental to any way of thinking about the longevity of a project, perhaps, are very ambivalent in terms of their relationship to a democratic project based on doing democracy. And that in particular leads to an ambivalence around the state. Not necessarily an anarchist rejection of the state, but a decentering of the state and a question mark behind the state. What do we want the state to do? Rather than being the sovereign source of democracy, can we ask if the state should be doing other kind of, performing other kind of roles in relation to democratic projects? So, alongside that, of course, we see in the various examples that we mentioned in the book, there's the housing cooperatives and other ones we have, there's entanglements driven by urbanization, the complexity of modern urban life, which ignore jurisdictions, which bring places together in interesting, peculiar, sometimes awkward ways. Place and materiality is important to the way people feel about themselves as political agents, to becoming a political agent. It's not something which can be abstracted from politics or the idea of democracy as it has tended to be. It's not an accidental background, a stage upon which real politics happens. Places and material context matter. So, alongside that, urban publics, so publics emerging, bubbling up, not necessarily in relation to the state, become a source of political subjectivity. This is an idea of becoming a democratic citizen through doing democracy, not through formalized rights of citizenship. Political subjects emerge through political practices. It's one implication of the arguments we are making. So, if we think there's lots of implications and questions in relation to that, to those kind of arguments, of course, but Here are a couple that we think are quite important and pertinent. In this view of democracy as being something which is embedded in collective life, in everyday life, the knowledges which play a role, which should play a role in democratic politics, are quite different. They're much more locally based, place-based. They can be experiential, things that are felt. And they emerge again in relation to practices. So that implies, of course, that democracy is always situated, it always has a context. It's always based upon a set of practices within a wider context of political action. So, final question which that might prompt is then that the question is not then to ask how urbanites can participate in political processes, but how planners can join in the production of urban space that citizens are already carrying out and performing themselves. So, thank you for your attention.
Sure, that's enough ground for a lot of questions.
Should we stay up here or?
If you want, yeah. You can also join us here. It feels a bit confrontative this way. It shouldn't be like that, but this way we are visible on the camera. So that's a bit nicer for those not here in this room, this room at the moment.
You didn't want to be on camera.
During the coming 20 minutes or so for discussion, then we have a coffee break. Feel free to move any chair around. If you feel you need to stretch a bit, it's also good for health reasons to sometimes change places. So the floor is open, the room has many options to move around as well to get into thinking. So is there anyone of you who has an immediate question maybe to Ross or Filippo or both? If you start, we have enough time. Also, you can say briefly who you are or what your major interest is, also beyond this single question. I see one, yeah. Get ahead.
So should I stand up and understand correctly, or can I sit here?
You can stay there. If you speak, try to speak a bit louder, and then that's fine.
Okay, so my name is Agatha Troost. I'm a postdoc from Economic Geography here at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences. And thank you a lot for the interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions, maybe in the direction of what you were talking about towards the end. So about the proximity of everyday life and how it's can sort of lead to political action. And then before that, I had some questions about how, because I mostly research on neighborhood effects and now on the housing market and also on brain drain, so sort of on more left behind spaces. So within the Netherlands, you can also see Northern Netherlands or the Groningen a bit as a sort of left behind territory compared to the Randstad. So I think in this context, I always see cities as places where people really want to be. Of course, like the discussion today is about cities, so I'm trying not to talk too much about like the areas outside of cities which get marginalized. But I do think that what's happening right now in the sort of most gentrified Dutch cities, so especially Amsterdam, but also The Hague, Utrecht, and so on, is that people are sort of pushed outside of the city as a way of excluding them from what you've been talking about, also like the politics, the sort of ways to organize. So, for example, you were talking about self-organization, housing cooperatives, this type of, like accessing housing and how it's very political. And what you see right now is some policies in the Netherlands where basically, as a sort of making districts more livable, they're demolishing social housing, and instead of, like building more expensive housing, which is the so-called social mixed policy. And of course, the result is mostly that people who cannot afford to stay in the city have to move out to the neighboring municipalities. And so I feel like from what you're saying, there's this sort of image of a city, okay, as long as you are in the city, then these possibilities are there for you. So on one hand, okay, maybe it is possible because you have more jobs, you have access to, I don't know, like if you're from ethnic minorities, to more people like you, but at the same, and if you're pushed out, that's more difficult because again, it's more, there's less infrastructure, less education, and so on. So that's true, that happens. But another thing, like my main question is, like even if you are in the city, just because you are in the city, it doesn't necessarily mean that you access these sort of social networks which give you access to different forms of capital. So you have differences between neighborhoods, but even within neighborhoods, even if, you know, like policymakers are implementing the social mix policy, you see that people with like different socioeconomic status or different social class, however you define it, like they don't necessarily interact with each other. So you even have examples, I think, from the UK also, when you have social housing, which according to the local laws has to be put in like the new housing developments, but then there is a different entrance for people from social housing and a different entrance in the same building for people who have are renting in the private sector. So my question is like how, with all these ideas that like you have politics of the city and you know, this urban space, maybe if I understood correctly, like it can lead to some forms of political organization. Well, maybe, you know, I don't want to be critical, but isn't it the case that very often it's not so? Like even if people are sort of physically close to each other, that the city is very exclusive. So maybe if you could say something about that.
Maybe we have more a set of concerns than a single question. So whoever of you likes to reply, or both of you.
Yeah, first of all, of course, thank you for these comments, concerns, and questions. I think a lot of people reacted like that, or not a lot, and I think it is quite important to understand that we don't, when we talk about the city, we don't see in our minds or before our eyes kind of these, as we said, kind of this particular spatial form of an inner city. So the city is really like an imaginary. So we don't, our argument is not that let's go and see what happens in cities and then move to a core city and then we will discover all these practices that we articulate or that we think are important to re-evaluate or reimagine democracy. So we don't make this kind of link from a spatial form to a political imaginary. The city is really kind of the bracket or the way to connect our democratic or our ideas around democracy and the observation around the organization. And so the city can be kind of a way to gather people together and to come to kind of different forms of political demands, to articulate political demands. And what is interesting also in the case of housing cooperatives, you could see, or you can see that there is a move out from the inner city where housing cooperatives were kind of built and emerged in the early 20th century, and now they're moving out even of Zurich to more distant kind of municipalities, but which have been urbanized along the last 30 to 40 years, and they emerge out in a completely different political context. As you said, the density of social interactions is less clear and less kind of prominent than in the core city, but still housing and how to organize housing emerges as a problem around which different people kind of congregate and come together, and the housing cooperative gets enacted in a different form again from how it kind of was enacted or implemented in the city. So that's exactly kind of the argument I think that I envisioned. So you have urbanization as a force, and urbanization kind of forces people also to react and to organize. And of course, not all people will organize in these ways. A lot of people decide, or not decide, or maybe forced out of these kind of political organizations. You can see that in Switzerland, where you have in these urban areas, at least 40 to 50%, in some municipalities, you have 40 to 50% of all residents are non-Swiss, so they don't have any political rights, so they are not even allowed, some of them, to become a member of a housing cooperative. So, of course, you have a lot of people excluded, but they organize in different ways to get their interests kind of heard and also implemented. So, I think the main kind of point to react to these concerns is that we don't believe that the city, or we don't land in the city and observe practices.
Just very quickly, I think very legitimate and important concerns to raise. If we look at most inner cities in not just the global north, but global north particularly, they're incredibly gentrified, exclusive places, and are becoming ever more so. So, as Philip says, there shouldn't be a fetish of this idea of the inner city. It does. I can understand why there can be an interpretation of some of our arguments that we are fetishizing by using this term city, this kind of space, which is then very centralized space. So, two other points is one is that the urban is a set of resources, or can become a set of resources, provides a different way of being a political subject. That doesn't mean to say that those resources are available to anyone and they're not opposed by power. The conditions of the city are such that power is arrayed against these kind of projects, these bottom-up grassroots projects. Anyway, another point I think, just on the as you're a geographer, we are seeing, of course, centres emerging outside the centre of cities. So we have central peripheralities, all these kind of playing with words, particularly in non-European contexts where mega cities are emerging, where you are finding huge densities of people on the outskirts of cities, in suburbs and high rises. And you are then in these contexts finding conditions of of certain forms of political resource, proximity, lots of people, density, things that were actually associated with the inner city of the past. So I think we just plead for a problematization of that periphery center argument, and take your good advice not to look to the center all the time.
I see one hand raising there. Is that true? Yeah.
Unless you wanted to follow up.
Go ahead.
I'm Steven Leinhauser, a postdoc from Groningen. I also did my PhD here at the Spatial Sciences faculty where Christian and Ellen are at. My question, well, I had to think right away of Marian Couninhan's work, Urbanization Without Cities. So where he sees the process of urbanization as this sort of bureaucratic flattening out of the city as a space of urban politics and democracy. So that book is really, I think, about like what the political unit of democracy is. And I had to think a little bit about that in relation to some of the questions you raised in the end. So you said that you look at democracy as these distinct practices rather than the institutional form or the sort of materialities of everyday life and place rather than jurisdictional scales. But that made me think to the extent that these distinct practices like a housing cooperative are dependent on wider enabling framework. What kinds of institutional forms and at which jurisdictional scales could enable more of these practices to be accessible to wider people? So basically how to connect those practices to wider state projects. Mm-hmm. Just to hear your thoughts about that.
I think that's a pretty interesting and good question. I think we didn't really resolve that in the book. We talk about different distances to the state and didn't kind of imply a distinct political structure that would help. I think when we go back to this example of the housing cooperatives in Switzerland and Uruguay, which is quite interesting because they have completely different political structures behind that. The Uruguayan case is really organized on a national level, supported by national government and national funding. In Switzerland, a highly decentralized, federalized country, there is no or hardly any support from national level. Everything is organized and supported by local public administrations. And both kind of systems in terms of how the housing cooperatives work are kind of functional to a certain extent. But when you dig a bit deeper, you can see that the housing cooperative in Uruguay is highly decentralized. It has kind of a strategic strong central kind of full of resources kind of unit, but the divided into thousands of singular housing cooperatives which are organized themselves. So, and in Switzerland, so the decentralization kind of the federal structure is built in the organization of the housing cooperatives themselves. And so I would still kind of make the thesis or argue that the state needs to be kind of cut into small pieces so that sovereignty is not too bold and too burdened with a lot of kind of functions, and that you have different access points that you can kind of get along, and maybe also change street level bureaucrats is easier to change them than to change a whole minister of housing in the center of the country. So I would strongly kind of argue that a decentralized political system is much more conducive for these forms of political action than a highly centralized one.
Yeah, I think we didn't in the book. We didn't get to that bit where we described those that possible framework, whether we call it an institutional framework. But I think we make one argument, and there's probably a clear implication of that argument. It's a theoretical normative argument that democracy should, the state shouldn't be the hope and the harbinger of democracy. And then from that, so that's a theoretical argument, it's a normative argument as well. From that, then we argue that we should have different projects of democracy should always have a relation. They always have a relationship to the state. It's inevitable. So even as they want to pull away and not be part of the state, they are in relation to the state. So there's a strategic relation. There's like a pragmatic level at which they meet. So if we were to think that through a bit further, we call that distances to the state, and they entail then co-option or potential for co-option in less forms of resource if you're further away from the state. But if we were to think those through a bit further, it would be a much messier picture, I think, of the state. Philip talked about fragmented or decentralized. To be clear with examples, I think you could imagine forms like public commons partnerships where the state and where the idea of sovereignty is the air is taken out of sovereignty so that it comes down, and the state and the citizen are kind of working more of a partnership form, is being some kind of light build, you know, if you wanted to think about it in more of an institutionalized way. But the arguments that we would make in our book is that would then be something that would be open to, would have to incorporate some of the messiness of democratic life. So that would be, not to say that it's always going to be slow, and democracy is necessarily slow politics, but the institutional diversity would have to accommodate political practices of the city.
Further comments or questions also from the back? In there, Marian?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a rich talk. I have two questions. I'll question along sort of two lines, and I guess also just to sort of put a flag in these two topics for hopefully later discussion as well. So the one thing was about your understanding of democracy, and what I read in your book is a sort of dominant understanding of democracy as self-organization, self-government. So very much that being the form of democracy which you focus on. But I wondered about, and of course that sort of naturally matches to the sort of more bottom-up or the focus on practice, for instance. But I wonder about aspects of democracy which are potentially not reached by that kind of self-organizing democracy. So I'm thinking here about, for instance, protection of minority rights, organizing a kind of productive consensus, or being able to manage or somehow deal with also dissensus, with pluralism in opinions. For me, a lot of the sort of collectives of urban life are often have a kind of also an exclusive quality in the sense that they're sort of maybe bubbles in a way, like it's not necessarily scalable to a context of more diversity. So there's a beautiful example that you gave at the beginning of this protection of these migrants that could have unpacked quite differently. Like it could have been a hostile mob who wanted to get rid of the migrant. Current mood in this country would be much more likely to be like that. So the idea that democracy, and maybe also in its more institutionalized form, has got these kind of guardrails on to protect, for instance, minority rights, or to organize, to manage disagreement productively. Could you say something about that? About the other question?
Well, I think there is a provocative answer to that. Of course, there is kind of this idealized version of institutional democracy, which kind of protects those minority rights. But when you look at it, there is a lot of questions to be asked. And I'm coming from Switzerland, as you know, and Switzerland has this kind of fantasy of being the oldest and best democracy in the world. But when you look at it, doesn't really function that way, because the institutionalized form of democracy can be highly exclusive. Even I would even suggest more exclusive than the local democracy. So if you look at, for instance, the right wingers in Switzerland who operate on the local level, they're much less exclusive than the ones on the national level, because they are confronted with issues on the local level, school issues. You cannot talk about Afghans or migrants in kind of abstract terms when you organize school districts, and then you realize it's not that the nationality is the problem, it's maybe the resources and maybe access to whatever. So
this is your first point, right? That it should be embedded in everyday life.
Yeah, and I think that kind of we tend to idealize the legally bound institutional democracy, and that's not a plea to kind of undermine the Rechtsstaat's idea of democracy, but to look at it quite open and frank, and to see what kind of exclusionary. And if you see the history of democracy over the last 70 years, it's not kind of, there are a lot of problematic things that have gone wrong. So I wouldn't pitch the one against the other. I would say that there are different scales, and there are also different scales of or the reaches, the scope of action and the reach of action is different. And so the harms are not so harmful when a local government does it in comparison to a national government comprising 80 million people, for instance. So that would be one. But I would support these concerns, because we have this idea that everything needs to be scalable, and everything and nothing can be exclusive to some forms. And that's something that Warren Magnuson also kind of juggles around in his argumentation when he makes a case for local government and more local government control, because localized local governments can be extremely exclusive, and not only migrants and foreigners, but also the not in my backyard kind of movements, where they don't want to have multi-story houses and they can organize them. Of course, that's a tension, but we have that tension all around us. It's not resolved through representative governments or representative democracy. It's the tension that we have, that we don't know all the time who should be the demos and who should be included and who should be excluded. That's what is democracy about, that we talk about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's going back right to Plato and the fear of the mob, and the idea that if you don't have these rules, then you'll have mob rule. So you can make those arguments, of course, but you can then also make the argument that rules can be made outside of formal institutions as well. Of course, there will always be flaws, and if you think of it if you talk about democratic theory now, if you think about it from the radical democracy tradition, then democracy is an ideal which is never achieved. It's always a project. And that's, I think, the kind of politics we're describing here. And I would also then just briefly reiterate that point that this form of politics already exists within, alongside, on top of wherever it is, entangled with state politics as it is. And there's quite a lot of great urban sociology showing, if we talk about migrants, just take an example of that the state is there's already an urban way of dealing with migration outside of the state. Even in hugely wealthy countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, the state doesn't reach into every street, every facet of life. there is an informality, there is another way of organising, even in those contexts. And when the state is a smaller presence, then this other presence is even stronger. That's not to idealise it as a better way, it's to say that it has the potential then to be organised in a better way.
And also to recognise that as part of democracy. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Is there another urgent question? Otherwise, I would invite you to this table over there, because there's coffee, I guess, and maybe tea. Coffee and tea. So we make a 10-15 minutes break. Toilets are outside to the left for a toilet. Ross and Philippa are here, so we can continue with all this discussion one-to-one or in smaller groups. Help yourself with coffee and tea. You'll see when we restart in 10-15 minutes. But let's try to give the largest applause possible for Ross and Philippa for your presentation.